Our reading today comes from John's Gospel. It's chapter 10 and verses 11 to 18, a section from what's entitled Jesus the Good Shepherd. And it's important to know that this reading comes after one of the longest, most involved and most instructive and sometimes hilarious stories that are told in John's Gospel of a healing, the healing of a man born blind. A very protracted exercise in chapter 9 of how somebody is healed on the Sabbath, and then Jesus has that familiar and traditional encounter with the religious authorities of the day who have an issue with that. And there's a marvellous line in verse 25 when, under serious questioning by the religious authorities about the rightness of Jesus' action and the motivations behind them, and how they're trying to make the man say that what Jesus did was wrong and to make judgments on his character, the man replies, "I do not know if he," Jesus, "is a sinner or not." The man replied, "One thing I do know, I was blind and now I can see." Kind of speaks for itself. So Jesus goes on to talk about spiritual blindness and makes the point that the religious authorities are really missing the point here. And so, to our reading, Jesus explains, "I am the good shepherd who is willing to die for the sheep. When the hired man, who is not a shepherd and does not own the sheep, sees a wolf coming, he leaves the sheep and runs away. So the wolf snatches the sheep and scatters them. The hired man runs away because he is only a hired man and does not care about the sheep. I, however, am the good shepherd. As the Father knows me, and I know the Father, in the same way I know my sheep, and they know me, and I am willing to die for them. There are other sheep which belong to me that are not in this sheepfold. I must bring them too. They will listen to my voice, and they will become one flock with one shepherd. The Father loves me because I am willing to give up my life in order that I may receive it back again. No one takes my life from me. I give it up of my own free will, and I have the right to give it up, and I have the right to take it back. This is what my Father has commanded me to do." So it's really interesting. I mean, we've got here another of those I am sayings in John's Gospel. I am the good shepherd. And it's interesting because in lots of our churches and chapels, you'll see depictions of shepherds, a kindly man holding a lamb in his arms, protective and pastoral. But of course, the original meanings of shepherd were very poignant for people who read these New Testament accounts. There's lots of talk by the prophets in the Old Testament of God being like a shepherd. And it's a good metaphor because the willful sheep who will go wherever they want to is a good metaphor for us. And someone who cares for them, takes them to safe pasture, gives them watches out for them, is a good metaphor, a bit like a kind and loving mother that's also used in many of the prophets' writings. So we have that idea of someone who is careful, of course, and loves the sheep, but also a shepherd was a ruler in the Old Testament thinking. So we're sort of missing the fact that this is quite a kingly idea of being a shepherd. But either way, we've got here Jesus saying, "I am the good shepherd," in stark contrast to the religious authorities, who, because of that healing miracle we were just talking about, had clearly missed the point. They had ended up not only criticizing Jesus for doing something that was undeniably good, but just happened to be on a day when people weren't meant to do work, if you can count healing and restoration of sight as work, but also just the motivation behind it. And what had they done to the man himself? Well, they'd thrown him out because he wouldn't play their game, because he wouldn't sign up to their power politics, they threw him out of society. He was ostracized. And that was a really heavy and bad thing. So the man had received sight and also came into a relationship with God, because Jesus came and found him later. If you were blind, he says, you were born up in sin. And what am I trying to say? Yes. Do you believe in the Son of Man? Jesus asked him. Yes. And the man says, I believe, Lord, the man said, and knelt down before Jesus. In a very reminiscent of Thomas in the upper room experience, the man had come into an awareness, as we've been talking about for many weeks, given by God, that intimate, close relationship with God, to say, I believe, Lord, my Saviour, my Lord, and my God. But here, the religious authorities had decided that actually the action was no, one must condemn Jesus for doing this terrible thing at the wrong time, and we must condemn the man. So in all ways, they were simply the hired sheep. They were the people who didn't care for them. They were just there doing something, fulfilling an office, but not actually careful of the people who they had pastoral care of. And I think this is a really stark warning to all of us, of course, who profess to have a relationship with God, that our behaviour needs to match those extraordinarily pure, beautiful and high moral standards, that our behaviour towards other people is always characterised by that self-offering love that Jesus so clearly talks about. That we're not judgmental, that we don't decide that certain people are not worthy of God's love or indeed our care, that there are rules that one must follow, lines one must not cross. God's love is for everyone all the time, otherwise we ourselves would not be beneficiaries of that great assurance, joy and love. So our actions need to speak of that, really speak of that, and not get entrenched in our own ways of thinking and be traditional or have fixed ideas about how things are meant to be. That's a really important challenge for all of us, because like the religious authorities, we may not walk around in particular robes or clothes or operate in a particular place, but we can certainly be very ecclesiastical, we can certainly be very churchy, we can certainly be very fixed and rigid in our thinking, born of our context, our tradition and our upbringing. And all of those things need to be constantly challenged against the demands of love. It was undeniably a good thing to restore the man's sight, to bring him out of being someone who relied on other people's grace and their generosity for his very existence, to being someone who was restored to normal life. That was undeniably a good thing to do. And to query the day on which it was done is churlish and weird, and not, you would think, in any way what God would have any part of. And yet that's what they did. But Jesus goes further than saying that he cares for people, that he is the good shepherd because he has an interest in people. He's willing to die for them. And this is stated quite explicitly and is a popular theme in John's Gospel, that Jesus is in complete and total control of his destiny. His own crucifixion, his own murder, would be an inevitable consequence of the challenge he was throwing down to the religious authorities, remembering that challenge was nothing he was doing, it was more just shining a light on their own darkness and making them feel bad and inadequate and guilty and challenged in a role that they believed brooked no opposition, because they believed in that terrible phrase that it was God's will. And that always, of course, is the ultimate put down, isn't it? And the motivation behind so many bad things in history, when people say, oh, it's God's will. Well, if it's not loving, if it's not kind, if it doesn't unite people, then I don't think it is. How can it be? Our actions need to be pure and holy, generous, extravagant, loving and kind. and always concerned with building people up rather than knocking them down or making them conform to a particular set of practices or places. But Jesus says he's the Good Shepherd for all those kingly and pastoral reasons, but also because he is willing to die for them. He doesn't just care, he's willing to make the actual sacrifice for them because they matter so much. And in all our lives, that's our attitude too. We need to try and strive to be like that other people's needs really do make a demand upon our time, that our life's purpose is to be there for others and to share what we know of God, back to what we've learned from Mary and the disciples and Thomas, who could all say in John's Gospel with their encounters of Jesus, "I have seen the Lord," and for that to be the motivation behind all their generous and loving acts.